Hey, today is Monday, April the 26th, and I am so glad to see you once again. Well, it's warming up. The farmers are out there putting the corn and the soybeans in the ground. It's beautiful outside, and I hope you're well. It's good to see you once again as we dive into God's Word once more. Now, if you've been doing our chronological Bible reading along with us here in 2021, you'll notice we have been reading a lot about King David the last week and a half, and we'll be reading more from King David the week ahead, and eventually we'll get into all of his Psalms. King David, he was the best of the kings of Israel. Last week we looked at when Samuel came and anointed David to be the next king of Israel. Saul was the current king, but David was anointed to be the next king. And when David was anointed the king, he was, something like 10, 11, maybe 15 years old. So at a very young age, David had this expectation placed upon him. And shortly after being anointed the next king of Israel, he goes out and slays the giant Goliath, standing more than 9 feet tall. And there are so many great things about David. In fact, last week we read about how God does not look on the outside like human beings look at outward appearances, but God looks on the inside. David, he's known today to be the greatest of all the kings of Israel. His life is filled with following God. He was, in a lot of ways, a military-esque king, meaning he went out into battles and he secured the borders of Israel. He brought Israel peace, unlike any other king. So much so that his son, who would become the next king, Solomon, his reign was filled with peace, and Solomon was able to use all of his wisdom to write books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. But David, he was a human being, just like you, just like me, and we know human beings have flaws. And David's his biggest hurdle in his life, we read about it today. If we're doing our chronological Bible reading, his biggest sin occurs today, April 26th. And his greatest sin comes in his lustfulness. He was a man, and he saw beauty, and because he was the king, he was not able to resist the temptation and the lust that comes into his heart. So a little bit from today's reading. It comes to us from 2 Samuel, the 11th chapter, beginning in verse 2. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he, being David, saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David a message saying, "I am pregnant." Now David, this lustfulness, he acts upon it. He has an affair with a married woman who was married to this man named Uriah, who was in the army, and it snowballs. It even gets worse from there because David wants Bathsheba as his own. He wants Bathsheba to be his wife, and so what does he do? He ends up sending Uriah onto the front lines in battle, fully knowing that when he's on the front lines, he'll meet his end. And so Uriah does die in battle. And David commits really this terrible sin. It started with having this affair with a married woman, but it compounds itself as he has a man essentially killed by sending him out into battle, fully knowing what would happen of it. And for really the rest of David's life, he lives with this sin. He lives with the grief, and he lives with the consequences of what he has done. Now, I think a lot of us think, the problem came when David acted upon his lust. He was a man, and for him to see a beautiful woman, it's hard for us to not have that happen to us. It's part of our DNA. It's a part of our biology. And if David would have just, looked at Bathsheba and not acted upon it, then he would have been okay. But, here's the thing. we live really in a time and a day and age where one of the great hidden sins of our generation that frankly pastors and people don't really talk about is how often people view pornography, porn, and especially on the internet nowadays where it's so readily available, and so many people do it in secret, and they think, as long as I'm not acting upon it, I'm not causing any harm, and it's just a private thing, and they feel a little bit guilty about it, but they're not acting upon it. Well, Jesus addresses this. Jesus talks about, he says, a lot of people think this, that if you look and you don't act upon it, it's not a sin. But in Matthew 5, Jesus speaks directly about this. Matthew 5, beginning in verse 27, where Jesus teaches us, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" So everybody knows this. If you're married, you're faithful to your spouse, and that's abiding by the sixth commandment. But Jesus continues, "I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Boy, that's a high standard from Jesus. That's something that, if we're honest, all of us fall short of that. All of us have looked at somebody else that wasn't our spouse, and we thought she was a babe, or we thought, he was a stud, or whatever we want to call it. But here's what we need to be more mindful of. When we are married, when we are committed to somebody, they truly deserve our all. They deserve us to treat them with the love, the respect, the dignity, everything that comes with being married to somebody else. And Jesus is really getting at something here. When you're unfaithful, and even if it's looking at porn or looking at somebody else and then having these thoughts, these impure thoughts inside of your head, you're really being unfaithful to your wife or your husband or your partner. And so, I think that's the message. I think that's the lesson from David as he sees Bathsheba, and he can't help himself, and he acts upon it, and really that sinfulness it's great, and it's dangerous, and it's dark, and it led David to do a truly just a horrific thing. But the lesson is we need to safeguard ourselves, and we need to truly analyze what we do as married people and as human beings, and especially when we're married to somebody, to give them our love and to give them our all. I'm so very grateful that you've stopped in once again for this devotion. Keep reading God's Word, diving into God's truth, and may you be blessed by it.